Hey, welcome back to our Holy Week series. We're looking at the events in Jesus' life that happened between Palm Sunday and Easter. And today's Wednesday. So we're going to look at what happened on the Wednesday of that week. And we're remembering that the things that happen here are some of the most important things that happen in the entire Gospels, because when it's your final week and you know that this is the last week that you're going to have, that's when you really get down to the things that matter the most and are the most important. So today we're going to look at three things that happened with Jesus. The first is the plot to kill Jesus. The second is the woman with the alabaster flask that anoints Jesus for burial. And the last one is Judas agreeing to betray Jesus. So let's go ahead and get into Matthew chapter 26, verses 1 through 5. And this is the plot to kill Jesus. And it says, when it came to pass, Jesus had finished all these sayings. So this is all the parables, all the teachings, everything that we looked at yesterday. It says, after he finished these, he says to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days is the Passover, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified." Then the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders of the people assembled at the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and they plotted to take Jesus by trickery and kill him. But they said, "Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people." So I find it really hilarious here that just back to back, Jesus says, hey, you know that after 2 days is the Passover, and this is when the Son of Man, Jesus, is going to be delivered up to be crucified. But it says that the people plotting to kill him said, but not during Passover, lest there be an uproar among the people. So Jesus is saying it's going to happen on Passover, but the people plotting to kill him are saying, let's do this just any day, not Passover. So this is actually a fulfillment of a prophecy. You know, it's prophesied that Jesus would be crucified on Passover. The religious leaders right here begin the actual plot to kill him. Now, they've been wanting to kill him the whole time, looking for ways to trap him, but this is when they actually plot it out, and they plan a timeline because they believe that they're in control of what's happening here. So both Jesus and the religious leaders are declaring the same thing. They're both declaring that Jesus is going to die. But one, Jesus, is using God's words. He's looked at the scriptures and said, this is what's going to happen and when it's going to happen. And the others are just doing it based on the fact that they believe they can control events. By Jesus declaring exactly when it will happen, he is showing that God is so in control of what's happening that he began telling it on the first Passover that happened back in Egypt. When the Passover was first established, you know, they talk about the sacrificial lamb being chosen, being selected on Lamb Selection Day. Then it goes through a week of testing to make sure it's spotless. And, you know, Jesus goes through all this time. He's selected, and that's the, Palm Sunday is Lamb Selection Day. And then he's put on trial for 3 days where he's proved to be blameless, and he's actually declared blameless. And then, of course, the crucifixion happening, So this is known from, before the foundation of the earth, it says. But even the first Passover, people should have been able to realize what was happening. God is so in control that he's orchestrating every event to happen exactly when he intended to happen, or exactly when he intended for it to happen. And so Jesus is declaring that. So even facing what would be Jesus's worst day ever, he still goes into it knowing that God is sovereign, that God is in control. He goes in knowing the prophecies, knowing how God is going to react, what's going to happen, and he knows God is sovereign. The religious leaders that are trying to kill him believe they are in control, but ultimately God proves that he is the one in control. Jesus actually says that no one takes his life from him, but he lays down his life voluntarily. I always want to ask this question to myself: am I able to rest in the sovereignty of God even when it feels like the enemy is winning? They probably thought that they were winning when they crucified him, even though it wasn't done on their terms. But they still got what they wanted, essentially. Later they realized that's not what they wanted. But they got what they wanted. And it would appear that the enemy was winning at this time. But Jesus was able to rest in the sovereignty of God, knowing that God had everything in control because he had declared that this would happen. The next thing that happens to Jesus right after he does this, right after he declares this to the disciples, is a woman comes in. It says in Matthew 26, verses 6 through 13. And when Jesus was in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, a woman came to him, having an alabaster flask of very costly, fragrant oil, and she poured it on his head as he sat at the table. But when his disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, "Why this waste? For this fragrant oil might have been sold for much and given to the poor." But when Jesus was aware of it, he said to them, "Why do you trouble this woman? For she has done a good work for me. For you have the poor with you always, but me you do not have always. For in pouring this fragrant oil on my body, she did it for my burial. Assuredly, I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be told as a memorial to her." So this woman does this tremendous act of worship, and it's a very prophetic act of worship because she's anointing Jesus for burial. She understands and believes the prophecy sometimes better than many of the disciples understood what was going to happen as they tried to resist Jesus' death. And here she is anointing his body for burial. The disciples weren't doing that. They were trying to prevent the death. She understood and she knew something. So she's being prophetic and she's worshiping. And this is an act of worshiping in spirit and in truth because the Spirit would have had to reveal this to her. And she understands a true truth that's about to happen. But the disciples had this response: why this waste? This oil probably cost about a year's worth of wages for most average people at that time. And they're looking at this like, whoa, this is a waste. We could have used this money. Maybe we could have fed the poor with it, whatever. And my question is, was it actually a waste? And the answer is no. First of all, because worship is never a waste. But second of all, because Jesus wasn't concerned about the money aspect of it. And I think that we view money differently than Jesus does. And he looks at it and says, I'm the provider. God's a provider. Money's not an issue. I can make coins appear in fish's mouth. I can, provide in any supernatural way that I want. Don't worry about money. Worry about worship. And so Jesus says, the poor you'll have with you always. And what he was saying is simply that this is a matter of being in this life. There are people who will be poor, and you can minister to them, and you should minister to them. But there is a time that we need to spend just with Jesus. In fact, before we really are going to be equipped to minister to the poor, we need to be spending time with Jesus. Worship of Jesus, time spent in his presence, that's what truly matters. Every time that we see people sitting before the feet of Jesus, when we see Mary sitting before Jesus and Martha complaining that she's not doing enough, and Jesus says, Mary has chosen the better thing, to just sit in my presence. Jesus was less concerned about our acts and what we're doing than he was about just being with him and spending that time with him and worshiping him. And so for this woman, this act of worship was far more important than selling it, getting the money, and giving to the poor. Jesus gave examples. Like, he didn't necessarily need money to minister to the poor. He fed 5,000 people with a little boy's lunch, including the little boy. And they had leftovers. He can pull resources out of wherever. God's not concerned about, whether or not we're going to have enough money to accomplish what he calls us to do. He'll supply that need. What he's worried about, I don't know if God's worried. What he's concerned about is, will we spend time with him? Will we worship him? Will we just sit in his presence and lavish him with extravagance? And then the last thing that we're going to cover today is Judas agrees to betray Jesus. So immediately after this, Judas, who happened to be the treasurer, it says in Matthew 26, 14 through 16, then one of the 12, called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, what are you willing to give me if I deliver him to you? And they counted out to him 30 pieces of silver. So from that time, he sought opportunity to betray him. Why does Judas betray him after being with him for so long? Was Judas bad from the beginning? In John 6, it actually says one of the 12 is a devil. But John wrote poetically and did not always write in chronological order as to when they learned things. He put in truths well ahead of time that they would have actually learned those truths. Jesus chose him. And Judas actually felt remorse after the fact. I don't think that Jesus would have chosen him if he was just a horrible person to be one of the 12, to be ministering. He fed the 5,000. He was part of the miracles. He saw the healing. I believe Judas betrayed Jesus because Jesus didn't live up to his expectations. Judas wanted Jesus, I think, it's my opinion, I think that Judas wanted Jesus to reign as an earthly king, to conquer Rome, to rise up and just pull dominion. He saw the power of Jesus. He saw the ability of Jesus. He looked at Jesus as someone who could create money from nothing, to create food from nothing. He could solve all the world problems with a snap of his fingers. And that's the kind of God he wanted, is someone who would just take care of everything. But Jesus wanted to be the kind of God, or God is the kind of God, that doesn't want to just solve problems with a snap of the finger. What he wants is for us to have a relationship with him, to lean on him, to learn dependency on him, so that we have a real relationship with him. And yeah, he's our provider and he's our comforter and he'll take care of us and he'll do all that stuff. He's our healer. But first, he wants to be our friend. He wants to love us. We were created for him to pour his love into us. And I think that's what Judas missed. How are we towards God when he doesn't meet our expectations? When we're asking him for something, when we claim a promise and we say, God, you said if I would ask anything, then I would get it. And I've asked to win the lottery 7 times and still I haven't won the lottery, or whatever it is. I've prayed for healing and I haven't been healed. And when God doesn't meet those expectations, what do? Do we run and become like Judas, who was willing to betray him for a very small amount of money? Or are we like the other disciples who say, well, we're going to stick by him and allow him to do what he's going to do and to be what he wants to be? It's possible, because Judas did this. It is possible to walk with Jesus for years and still betray him and still not have that true relationship with him. It's possible to walk with Jesus for a long period of time and never really know him. And that was the problem that Judas had. He didn't really know Jesus. And so he didn't expect for him to rise again. He didn't expect for him to conquer death. He didn't expect for him to bring salvation. He just didn't have those expectations, because he didn't know his Lord. He did not know his master. Ultimately, Jesus knew that this betrayal would happen, but that never stopped him from loving Judas, never stopped him from allowing him to minister, never stopped him from treating him just like any of the rest of the disciples. And he's right there at the Passover, the Last Supper, with all the rest, right up to the point where Judas makes enough bad decisions that it allows Satan to enter him, and then he goes off and actually does the deed. I don't want my relationship with Jesus to be that superficial. When I walk with him for years, I want mine to be like the cry of Paul that just says, my heart cries to know him, that I want to know him and the fellowship of his suffering, but the joy of his resurrection, the power of his resurrection. I want to know Christ in every single way possible. And that's my prayer for you during this entire week of Holy Week and going into Easter, is that your desire and your cry will be to know Christ, to know him more, to know his resurrection power, to know the fellowship of his sufferings and what that means for us, to understand what this week is truly all about. So that's my prayer for you and my blessing for you this week. And I look forward to seeing you Thursday, where we will look at the Last Supper and the Garden of Gethsemane.